This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome once again to the Dr. Digital podcast. And I have a special guest today. This is Ivan Reilly from Moxehub. And you know that a lot of listeners want to hear about entrepreneurs. They want to hear about good companies, exciting companies. People are making some real changes. And that's really why I wanted to get Ivan on the show today. Give you an idea, he's also from the best city of the United States, which of course is San Diego, me too. So he's interested in disruption. So I like that right away. He does strategic solutions to revolutionize the landscape in digital ecosystems. So with all of that, I'd like to try to dig down into that a little bit and kind of unpack that a little bit for the audience. So what he does is he takes ideas from concept to product. It's ethical, transparently, in an efficient fashion, and something that business needs. That's definitely it. So I wanted to get him on the show today. He's also, of course, related to and associated with Big Brother. So I got to hand it to him for a little bit of the community work. He also actually knows a previous guest on the Dr. Digital podcast, Carlo Rivas. So that's really interesting. Small world. But in any case, let's get to it. And the Dr. Digital podcast, to say a little bit about, if this is the first time you're listening, what we do is we talk to CEOs, business leaders who want to grow their business using social audio. And the internet is going to be all audio. That's what I'm trying to address. So listen to the end of the show. Also, we got a complimentary website analysis. So stick around for that. So with that as an introduction, Ivan, thank you for taking out some time from your schedule. Welcome to the show. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and the story of how you got going with Moxehub?
Sure, would be happy to. Firstly, thank you for inviting me onto the show. And I know you have some avid listeners that are tuning in to speak to entrepreneurs and listen to entrepreneurs and
yes, sir.
And listen to how people can get started in this business. So I'm happy to do so. I am based out of San Diego at the moment, but for your listeners, that's an Irish accent you're going to hear. I was born and raised in Ireland, not far from the city of Dublin, in a little town called Navan in County Meath. And, you know, after spending some time in business and sales, after a few years in Dublin, I actually got a nice break to work for an educational book publisher, an American company called Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. And I was actually responsible for their Apple Endeavor umbrella, which was the traditional transformation of textbook into digital format for iBooks and mobile assessment applications. Yes. And that's what brought me to the US almost 9 years ago now, 9 years ago this year. Okay. And I spent a few more years with them in Boston working on digital concepts, and then broke into big pharma and big healthcare. Mm-hmm. So worked on digital champions for Eli Lilly. So we were building out the last piece of the ecosystem, as you refer to it, for diabetes patients. So they're, you know, working in molecule development, working on device development, and then me and my team brought in the digital component to attach to the molecule. So after a number of years working there and being responsible for hiring vendors like Moxehub and hiring designers and vetting that designers and engineers around the world, I thought it was a great opportunity for me to break into that market and start up my own business, which is what I've done coming up on 3 years now. So Moxehub is still in its infancy per se. However, you know, we've been very fortunate to be in auspicious positions to work with big clients like the Novartises of the world, like the FEMA Healths of the world. Right. So, you know, we really pride ourselves on our mission statement, which is to work on products that have an impact in people's lives in the macro. And you get an opportunity to do that in this current market segment that we're all in, right? This is a digital world that we live in. Absolutely. But Moxehub is essentially in the trenches with these companies that want to bring their conceptions to light and want to bring their dreams to fruition. So we help them do that, and we help them, you know, over the whole course of the project lifecycle and product lifecycle to go from conception to potentially commercialization or enterprise level. So we're full stack design, full stack engineering shop, and we have an interesting model right now, which is onshore domestically here in the US, nearshore, which is where some of our teams are down in Latin America, and offshore, which we have some designers and some representation in Europe. So we've got kind of a three-pronged approach for diversity as well as capabilities and skill set.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. So a lot of great stuff there. So I also saw that you had some background in educational component, because I too come from an educational background, distance learning, and a lot of those things. So yeah, I really caught that on your resume as well too. So in this point of having so many things that have happened, even though for a short amount of time, but there is really a lot of dynamism there. Could you address some of the changes that you've seen to get us to the point that we are today? So what have you seen there?
So it's funny, because over the past 24 months, people are seeing and being part of a huge paradigm shift in corporations that are trying to build digital components and digital offerings to their solutions because of the pandemic.
Right.
But really, from in my world, we were observing this years prior. And of course, it was accelerated and amplified as a result of the pandemic, and rightly so. However, these subtle innovations have been changing our world and becoming part of our everyday lives subtly over the past 10 plus years, but most certainly 2 or 3 years prior to the pandemic, there was a huge shift in remote working systems and remote working environments, and the whole science behind how human beings were engaging with technology, the psychology actually behind how human beings were engaging with technology. I think Gartner put out a report in early 19 or mid 19, Q1 or Q2, followed by Deloitte and McKinsey backing up the statement that by mid to end 21, early 2022, 80% of what we consume as human beings is going to be all bite-sized video technology based and streaming based, and as you referred to yourself, Mick, audio based. So, our world has been changing for some time now, but it most certainly has been rapidly amplified, and the velocity has changed dramatically over the past 2 years because of the pandemic, because, the LMS systems that you refer to, right? So the school systems went remote, and medical care went remote, and so many of these markets and verticals that weren't prepared for a pandemic per se on a global scale, let alone a domestic scale, they had to ramp up and they had to shift their attention and draw their attention to, hey, if we don't move with the times and become a little bit more adaptable to how technology is changing our world, then we might get left behind here. But it had been changing most certainly a few years prior to the pandemic.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, because that's exactly how I see it. It's just, these were things that were happening pre-pandemic, but then when the pandemic hit, it was like, okay, a lot of people have said, we really have to jump on board. So without
you see,
go ahead.
Just on that, you also see that there's the Gen Ys and the Gen Zs and the millennials who, our generation might tend to just look at them in a certain light. However, they're also going to make up 70 to 80% of the workforce by the end of the 2020s. So that's the future of everything. And, our generations and the older generations and the demographics might be saying, well, we're not too, fast with adopting new technologies, but we actually are, because, my father came over to visit me a few years ago. We were downtown in Manhattan, and he was looking around Times Square and asking me where all the yellow taxis were. And I said, oh, Dad, that's a thing of the past. Now we're using this to GPS locate where we are, and it's an app called Uber. So he couldn't fathom what I was even talking about. So I have an Alexa here in the kitchen area of my apartment that can give me the recipe for anything. We have got an encyclopedia in our phone that's on our person at all times, which extends our knowledge set. We're using banking applications to deposit checks. So we're becoming more and more obsessed with removing friction, even the older generations, right? So I want to go to a meeting. I know I'm going to be late for the meeting, but I want to get a coffee on the way. However, I don't have time to stop and stay in line and do all of the manual touch points. So I use my Starbucks application. I walk into the store, pick it up. And by doing that, I remove 7 manual steps or 7 friction points of connectivity and communication that would have been there if I had not have used my application. So for somebody who kind of, is in the trenches with these technologies and these emerging technologies, we as human beings are becoming more and more obsessed with removing friction from process so we can move faster and even eliminate the need to communicate, which is quite sad in some ways, right?
Yeah, well, that's, I make the comment about the podcast. It's social audio, but what you're saying is really what I'm talking about, because we're now interacting and usually using audio or our voice, because who wants to type if you don't have to, and who wants to interact if you don't have to, because it's a lot faster and easier. Are these the hot growth areas that you would say? Because that's one of the questions I had, is this a hot growth area, meaning that everything is frictionless or in distance and interacting that way?
Yeah, everything. So we've been building a product for a number of years, where we're using new technology to solve an old problem, right? And while there's many, I guess, cons to technology and how we're changing, and again, the psychology and the science behind our engagement, one, that's all changing. There's many ways you can still use technology in a positive manner, in a positive light. But you can see that in most, if not all, market segments and businesses that, companies are trying to remove friction. individuals are trying to remove friction from their everyday lives, like the examples that I just gave, looking for a faster way to text or communicate, a faster way to pick up your coffee, using applications to have your groceries delivered to your living room and to your kitchen. So we're becoming obsessed with that, but hyper automation is really at the forefront of all of these mechanisms for corporations and enabling them to move more efficiently, more effectively. And then of course that has dramatic effect for their bottom line in many cases. So there's a hot pot right now for technology, but hyper automative tools and emerging tech is where it's really, really going over the next couple of years.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to just pull back just slightly. If you're a business owner, let's say, and maybe the people that you're dealing with, what would you recommend a business to start thinking about, if not already, if they haven't jumped on board or they're thinking about moving into this digital ecosystem? What would you say a business ought to be doing now if they haven't gotten there yet?
Well, it also depends on the vertical and depends on the business in many aspects. You know, there are ways to be forecasting and predicting. Like a lot of the metrics that I threw out there, if there's fact checkers, they might have changed from yesterday to today and today to tomorrow. It's like a moving target for corporations. I guess I read a fantastic book a few years ago by Simon Sinek, and it was Start With Why.
Oh, yeah.
So you know, so really us at our company at Moxehub, you know, from the bottom up, you know, not just the top down, everybody at the corporation knows our why. Now, why is our mission? Our mission is to work on programs that have an impact on people's lives. If the mission of a company coming to us doesn't work with our ethos and our approach to project and product development, then we're probably not going to work with them. And we don't want to be arrogant in cherry picking. But really, Simon Sinek is kind of trying to educate people. Well, we speak to a lot of entrepreneurs and you speak to a lot of people who have started business and you ask them about their why and they start rattling off the what and the when and the how, and this is what we do differently. And then they'll get challenged again and ask, well, that's not your why. What's your why? And then they start talking about the financial cost structures and the revenue streams and the dangling carrots and the economic reward. But that's the reward. It's still not the why. So he was maintaining for a long period of time that every entrepreneur and business owner that he spoke to really couldn't give them the why, except when he started speaking to Apple and when he started speaking to Google and when he started speaking to Amazon and when he spoke to Jeff Bezos. Like these people and these corporations, they are $1 billion and $1 trillion organizations because they know their why. It's not the how they develop the product. It's not what the product is, but it's actually why they develop the product. And usually it's for understanding the end user and understanding your demographic and your customer base. So, you know, I've been working with a couple of entrepreneurs and new business owners recently, and I implore them to understand the why of the company before they even build out the generational business model, understanding the why of your corporation. What are you trying to achieve? And unfortunately, we do live in a world that's very expensive and a lot of people are setting up businesses to make a lot of money. That's okay. But figure out how you can complement that with understanding your company's need and your ethos and your mission. So that's what I will be saying to a lot of new business owners and entrepreneurs. If you can really figure out the why of your corporation, then the how and the what, and most certainly if you provide operational excellence, the economic reward will be an inevitability. It's just a matter of how you set it up. The why is super important. And the why has inextricable links and ties to your demographic and your customer base and what you're trying to achieve with your company. So nail that down first and foremost and figure out where you go from there.
And that's a really interesting point, because most people are going to do just the opposite. Like you say, they look at the money first, and it's like, well, you're losing the whole point of what you're really in business for. Like a lot of people say, solve a problem, right? If you don't have the problem solved, then who's interested? Could you identify, let's say there are companies or people out there listening, and what kinds of companies and what kind of businesses do you think that would be particularly good to work with you?
To work with us at Moxehub?
Yes.
Yeah, so we've been some of the companies that I mentioned at the beginning here they were important to mention because my background is, you know, when I think about my background, I think about it in the education space for Houghton Mifflin / Apple, working on the Apple team, and then working at Eli Lilly, which is big pharma. So I've got a very, some people talk about those verticals, the healthcare systems and the education systems as being kind of flawed, and I can see it from a different angle because coming from Europe, the systems and those verticals in Europe are quite different. So when we set out on this journey 3 years ago, we wanted to be agnostic because technology is agnostic. If you come to me and ask me to do LMS system for a book publisher, we can build out LMS systems, but the technology that sits under the system is just code, and the code is agnostic if you think about it like that way. Anyone who can code an application that for an LMS, or an application for a pharma application, or an application for a gaming application, right? There's subtle differences, of course, but the design system dictates what you engineer and what you code. Sure. So we've been fortunate when we set out on our mission. This is a great question for us because it goes back to our why. If we get an opportunity to work on programs that have an impact on people's lives, we will take them. We've kind of specialized, if not just focused, in healthcare, life sciences, and pharma for a number of years, because those were the programs that you get to make the biggest impact, I believe, on humanity, right? There's nothing like working on a clinical decision support solution that you are now building an engineering component to, and then putting it into the hands of a patient who, you are trying to improve their everyday life by using technology, because technology is getting, in many ways, criticized because it's segmenting people, which it is. It's segmenting people in many forms and in many ways and in many parts of the world for the way it's been utilized and its intended use isn't staying true to why it was designed or engineered in the first place. But in pharma, sometimes you see that you're working on programs that have a huge impact on people's lives in the macro with technology. So we've been very fortunate to be working in that arena. But right now, as a result of the past 24 months, there are so many opportunities out there. There are many Moxehubs per se, right? There's many Moxehubs domestically and on a global scale, but we separate ourselves from the pack on how we actually approach product development and how we approach the problem. Because a lot of the vendors out there, and not to call anybody out, but they really are not incentivized to hit their targets in project management or product development, which is, milestone based, scope based, timeline based. Because if you add more scope, essentially you add more time. If you add more time, essentially you add more money. Sure. So the vendors that I'd worked with for the past 15 years, they've all done the same thing. We set ourselves up a little bit differently in our approach to product development, meaning that we help educate, if not really understand, what the company and what the client wants to build. And more often than not, they have about 80% of the idea baked, and a vendor will help them with the remaining 20%. There's some cases where they have 50% of the idea baked, and we help them with the other 50%. But really, if you don't buy down that risk and ambiguity, and we try to buy it down up front, then what happens is you blow out your trifecta of deliverables, which is scope, time, and budget. We separate ourselves a little bit differently by doing it up front.
Yeah, and I will also say you're really upfront, which is, I like the description. It's ethical, it's transparent, and you say all good things.
It's not so. What you're selling there is process. Yeah. Right, and process is not a sexy sale, right? It's very hard for you to say, hey, by the way, before we actually get into design and before we write a line of code, how about we just take a period of time of about 1 to 2 weeks where we do a thorough gap analysis and a discovery process that actually validates what you think you want to build. And they're like, well, why can we not do that during the process? Well, you can, but then you're going to have a change control management process, and then you're going to have a change control timeline shift and a cost shift and all of the above and a resource shift. So we actually, we try and ask them to buy down that time up front, which is, again, a difficult sale. And we actually sometimes don't put a price on that, but we say, hey, it is best that you nail this down now and not try and ask these technical questions during design. So by the time we get to design and then we move through from design to engineering, the engineering is becoming the smallest pole in the tent, where at one stage in product development, it was the largest and the longest. So we set ourselves up a little bit differently.
Yeah, and it's I applaud that, because it's something that sometimes people assume, they're ethical and transparent, but no, you have to say it. And of course, what's really important, you have to live it out, right? So that's Absolutely. Good.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of things that you had covered. So I think that people get a really good sense of what you do and kind of the unique way that you're approaching things. If a business owner is listening, or an individual, and they have some interest in what you're doing, how would you recommend that they get a hold of you, and what's your contact information?
Yeah, so we can we use all of the usual channels. We're on all of the social media sites, kind of representing who we are, what we do, and sometimes putting up projects that we've worked on. From me personally on LinkedIn, to Moxehub on LinkedIn, to our Twitter accounts, our Instagram accounts. And then we have a new business development channel where we can leave our email for anybody who wants to reach out to us as well.
Outstanding. So hopefully people do, because it's very exciting to hear what it is that you're doing. So that's why I wanted to get on the show. Thank you so much for taking some time out, your busy schedule, and chatting with me today.
My pleasure.
Time, Ivan.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
Good deal. All right. This is the Dr. Digital Podcast. And if you want to get a hold of me, because I said if you listen to the end, you get a complimentary free website analysis. So how are you doing in opposed to your clients and your customers? How are you dealing with them? That's what I can offer you. So if you want to get a hold of me, this is Mick, as in Jagger, except he makes more money, mick.smith@wsiworld.com. Also get a hold of me directly at 619-389-3636, 3636. And if that's it for this particular episode, thanks again for Ivan coming on the show. We'll see you next time. Deus Volt.